Hello, this is an outline of A4.1, Evolution and Speciation. We are in the theme here, Unity and Diversity, and we are up at the ecosystems scale. In this outline, we will go through each learning outcome one at a time and try to stick to just what you need to know. So a couple guiding questions for this topic. The first one is, what is the evidence for evolution? The theory of evolution is very strongly supported by evidence, so we touch on some of that. And second, we talk about analogous and homologous structures and link those to our theme, which is unity and diversity. So starting with the first learning outcome, which is basically just a definition of what evolution is, and getting into a comparison of Darwinian evolution, which is how we define evolution today, and something called Lamarckism. So first off, I think we all have a sense of what evolution is, but what is it exactly that defines it? So in other words, when can you say evolution has happened in a species? And the answer is when the heritable characteristics of a species population have changed. So key points here, first is evolution acts on heritable characteristics only. So these are the characteristics that can be passed on from parent to offspring. And so today we know these are the characteristics that are determined or at least influenced by our genes, by our genetic information coded in our DNA. These are the only kinds of characteristics that can be passed on to our offspring, so they're the only kinds of characteristics that can be acted upon by evolution. Second point here is evolution happens at a population scale, and it happens over a long period of time in general. So it's not like an individual is evolving. I'm not evolving, but a population of individuals of a given species can change over time. And if we look at particular traits, for example, eye color or height or brain size or whatever you want to choose, as long as it's heritable, we can measure those changes in a population over time to show that evolution has happened. The current idea of evolution is what we call Darwinism, and it's also this idea of Darwinism is referring to the method or what would you call it, the way that evolution happens, the mechanism. That's the word I was looking for. And his mechanism for evolution that Darwin proposed was natural selection. We get into natural selection in more detail in another topic, so we're not going to get into it too far here. But I just want to mention it because it is quite different from the idea that came before him, which is Lamarckism. So Lamarck's idea was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So his idea was that organisms would change over their life because of the challenges that they faced. So for example, a giraffe might develop a long neck so it can reach food in a tree. And then those organisms, as they change in their lives, as they acquire characteristics, they pass those on to their offspring, thereby allowing for change each generation. We know this idea is not correct today because a lot of those acquired characteristics, the things that Lamarck was thinking about, aren't actually heritable. So for example, if I go to the gym a lot and try to build some muscle, and then I have kids, it does not mean my kids will now have muscle because I acquired those characteristics. That's not a heritable trait. Or if I study really hard and get really smart at something, it doesn't mean my children will be really smart at that because, again, that trait that I would have acquired was not heritable. It's not something I passed on to my offspring. Now, I could pass on, for example, intelligence if that was determined in part by my genes, or I could pass on my hair color and so on. Darwin's idea is quite different. He recognized that variation already exists within populations, and some of that variation is passed on from parent to offspring. And he realized that if some individuals within a population are more successful than others, and they pass on their traits to their offspring, then over time those populations will change and tend to include more individuals with those traits that were more successful, and in that way populations become adapted to their environments. I'm very quickly there describing natural selection, which we get into, again, we'll get into a lot more detail later on. Okay, so like I mentioned, a big part of this section is touching on the evidence for evolution, and we look at some different lines of evidence, some different types of evidence. So the first type of evidence that we're going to look at briefly is base sequences, and here we're talking about DNA or RNA, and amino acid sequences in proteins. So generally what we do today to build cladograms and to understand how organisms are related is we look at molecular data, specifically base sequences or amino acid sequences, usually base sequences today, within a given gene or a given protein. And then we compare them across different species and we look for differences. And what we find is that species that are more closely related, that we believe are more closely related based on what we've observed in their structure and so on, they tend to have fewer differences, genetic differences or amino acid sequence differences for any gene or protein, which is consistent with the idea of evolution, of this change over time due to some traits being selected for and some not, and those traits that are selected for being passed on from parent to offspring. And so we're not going to get into much detail on this kind of evidence. We're not going to get into all the ways that this evidence is analyzed. This kind of evidence is analyzed, but we'll just say that there's a lot of it, and it's very consistent with the relationships that we hypothesize. All right. Hopefully my brain starts working a little bit better because I'm struggling to speak smoothly here, but oh well, let's keep going. More evidence. Another example of evidence is this idea of selective breeding from either domesticated animals or crop plants. And this idea is that we humans have caused evolution to happen through this thing called selective breeding, and we've caused changes to happen very rapidly. And it's sort of a proof of principle. We have proven that this idea of evolution can work because we have caused it to occur within sort of human timescales. So starting with domesticated animals, and Darwin noticed this as well, humans have modified other species many times over our history, and this is called artificial selection. And so we do this all the time. So I mean, think about dogs. The dogs that humans own have all been created by humans through artificial selection. So we would choose some trait that we're interested in. Maybe we want a cute dog with short legs and a long body. And if you keep choosing individuals that have short legs and long bodies and allow them to interbreed with each other, over time you will get a dog with short legs and a long body. We do that in other cases too, like think of cows. The cows that we use for milk or for meat, we have created those through artificial selection. So we can choose traits that we're interested in and also choose traits that we're not interested in. And if we want a certain trait to increase, we just allow those individuals that have that trait to reproduce. And if we want a certain trait to go away, We don't allow individuals that have that trait to reproduce. That's called artificial selection. Here's an image just showing how we've done that for various farm animals. So you can see how we've created different kinds of cows and pigs and sheep. And at the bottom there, it's cut off in horses for various purposes through this process of artificial selection. And it's not only true for animals, we've done the same thing for plants. I thought this was interesting. All of these vegetables that hopefully you're familiar with, like cabbage, broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, these have all been created by humans. They're not naturally occurring plants. The naturally occurring plant is this small plant called wild mustard. And we just selected certain things about that plant, selected certain traits, allowed those plants to reproduce. We would pollinate them ourselves. And we created all of these different vegetables. So cabbage was created by only selecting plants that had a particularly large apical bud. And over time, the apical bud got really big, and that's what cabbage is. Or we selected individuals that had big flowers and stems. Then over time, we got broccoli, because broccoli has a big stem, and the part on the top is actually the flower, a young flower. So we've been able to create these different vegetables relatively quickly just by selecting which individuals can reproduce to make each successive generation. And since the traits we're selecting for are heritable, meaning they are determined or influenced by the genetic code, they're passed from parent to offspring, and they can increase in the population over time. So really, we have seen evolution happen through this process. The only difference between this and natural selection is in natural selection, humans aren't doing the selection, nature is. Another example of evidence you need to be able to discuss is this idea of homologous structures, and specifically the pentadactyl limb. So a homologous structure, we've talked about it before, I think when we looked at cladograms, are the kinds of things that we use to figure out who's related to who. These are structural similarities among species that are similar because they both inherited that structure from their common ancestor. Those structures, these homologous structures, might be used in different ways or have changed slightly because of evolution to different environments, to different niches. But if you look closely, the similarities are still there, suggesting that they were inherited from a common ancestor. And so an example that you need to know is the pentadactyl limb. Penta means 5, dactyl means fingers, limb like arm or hand. So if we look at humans, cats, whales, bats, for example, they all have a pentadactyl limb. Now, they do look quite different, like a whale's fin and a human hand are very different. And that's because a human and a whale have adapted to survive in different environments. But if you look at the bone structure very carefully, you can see that all of these organisms have the same bones in the same positions. They all have a humerus, a radius, an ulna, and so on. Now, they've changed over time due to divergent evolution, but they're still there. And so what explains that? Well, the simplest explanation for that similarity is that they all inherited that set of bones in those positions from their common ancestor. So it's evidence that all these organisms that are quite different today, like whales and cats and bats and so on, they share a common ancestor that had these structures, these homologous structures that we're seeing today, were inherited from a common ancestor. It's the most likely explanation. Just a small note here. Often we see homologous structures in embryos, which is sort of interesting. For example, human embryos and chick embryos both have a tail, a similar structured tail. We both have these things called pharyngeal pouches. A lot of those homologous structures disappear, like they through development, they disappear. They get absorbed into the body of these organisms. So at birth, most humans don't have a tail, for example. But you can see it in the embryo, and it provides evidence of shared ancestry. Okay. So we use these homologous structures to determine ancestry, to create cladograms, to see how organisms are related. One issue is that organisms can develop quite striking similarities even if they didn't gain those structures from a common ancestor, just as a result of evolving in the same environment. So this is called convergent evolution. And these kinds of structures are called analogous structures. So we don't actually want to use analogous structures when we're making cladograms, when we're trying to determine how organisms are related to each other, but you need to know what they are and why they exist. So they are the result of convergent evolution. They have similar functions, but if you look very closely, they're only superficially similar. They're structurally quite different. Not much new here. Again, these things are the result, these structures, analogous structures, are the result of convergent evolution. So evolving to similar environmental conditions, evolving within a similar niche. And in those cases, you would expect that organisms evolving in similar conditions would evolve to acquire the same traits that allow them to survive best in those environments. And I think I've shown you this one before. So this is an example of some analogous structures. If you just looked very quickly at a dolphin, a shark, and an ichthyosaur, ichthyosaurs are extinct, but dolphins and sharks are certainly still around. If you just looked at them superficially, you might think, oh, well, they look very similar, so they must be very closely related and have all acquired those traits, like the fins and so on, from their common ancestor. Well, that's not the case. The structures that they share in common, they all evolved independently due to convergent evolution to allow them to be strong swimmers in the ocean, essentially. So sharks are a fish, dolphins are a mammal, right? And ichthyosaurs are a reptile. And so they don't have a common ancestor that looked like them. And so their structures evolved independently through convergent evolution, and we would call those analogous structures. And those kinds of structures can be misleading when we're trying to figure out the relationships between organisms. All right, the evolution of analogous structures is an example of how evolution can lead to unity over time, like similarities among organisms. The rest of this presentation is about how evolution leads to diversity. Okay, so remember our theme A is unity and diversity. Evolution is the cause of all the diversity in life that we see. It is why we have so many different species on this planet. So this process of the formation of new species through evolution is called speciation, and it's the only way we get new species. There's sort of two processes that impact the diversity of life, or this idea of biodiversity, the number of species that exist, and they are speciation and extinction. So speciation, the splitting of one species into two, is what creates biodiversity. And then we also have the opposite process, extinction, and that's what decreases biodiversity. both of those processes are always happening at the same time. Over the history of life on Earth, there has been more speciation than extinction because we have more species than we did at the beginning, right? There was one species to start, right? The LUCA, Luca, the last universal common ancestor, and now we have many species. That's not to say extinction isn't happening. It is happening, and the rate of extinction is actually increasing because of human activities. We'll get to that in another topic as well. But the huge biodiversity that we see is due to speciation. This diagram nicely shows how speciation occurs. So as long as a population sort of exists and is able to interbreed within an area, their genes are always mixing with each other, and therefore their characteristics are always going to be mixing. And sort of the average characteristics of a population wouldn't, like, they could change over time, but they wouldn't change in different directions as long as all the individuals within a population can mix and interbreed. We sometimes say that there's populations like this that are free to mix, have gene flow. It means that the genes will flow among individuals across generations because of reproduction. And in those cases, populations they can change, they can evolve to their environments, but they won't separate, they won't split because the genes are always flowing across individuals. There's just a single gene pool, we sometimes say. If a barrier to gene flow is established and we end up getting separate gene pools, in other words, separate populations of a given species that no longer interbreed, and then those populations are exposed to different conditions, then you would expect them to evolve down different paths. And when that happens, we are able to get new species through this process of speciation. Here you can see how speciation can lead to the diversity of life. It's sort of this exponential process where if you started with one species at the beginning of life on Earth, then you end up with 2, and in this case 5, and then 7, and so on. You can see over time, and remember, life evolved a long time ago, first formed a long time ago. Over these long time scales, you can end up with a lot of species. And it's the only way that different species form is through this process of speciation. And it's what explains our tree of life. So here's a cladogram of all living things, roughly. And every little split in that tree, every time there's a divergence, that's a speciation event. Remember that extinction also happens. I'm showing this tree of hominin evolution just to point out the significance of extinction as well. Look at all the different species of hominin shown there, tracing back to Sahelanthropus chilensis, maybe the common ancestor of all of us. But if you look at those lines, so the x-axis here is showing time, and only species that have made it to the 0, to the far right, are still existing today. And so at the top we have our cousins, gorillas and chimpanzees. They're still alive today, but beneath them, all the hominins, all of our closest ancestors, they went extinct, right? So the only one that still exists today is us, Homo sapiens, and the other ones all went extinct, including the Neanderthals and Homo floresiensis and Homo erectus. At one point, we did live at the same time as them, and so there was more than one human species around. But for some reason that we're not sure about, they went extinct and we're the only ones left. And so for us humans, extinction has been quite important, really, because it's left us sort of alone as the only member of our genus. So we're still on this topic of speciation, and we're trying to understand how it can happen. So one point that I emphasized is that for speciation to occur, populations need to become isolated from each other. There has to be a barrier to gene flow. There has to be something to stop two groups from interacting and reproducing with each other so that they can then follow their own evolutionary paths. One way that this happens is through geographical isolation. So there's actually a physical barrier between populations that prevents them from interbreeding. And those different locations then might have different environmental conditions, and those populations might then end up, you would expect them to end up following different evolutionary paths and eventually becoming different species. The example that you need to know about is the formation of bonobos, the evolution of bonobos in chimpanzees from a common ancestor. So they are different species. They don't interbreed today. And they have quite different characteristics. Chimpanzees tend to be more violent with each other, and bonobos tend to be more gentle and loving. They also look a little bit different. Bonobos sort of have these longer arms and they're sort of more slender, whereas chimpanzees are like a little more muscular. But they both evolved from a common ancestor. And maybe it was 1 million years ago. I don't quite remember the number. The hypothesis is that that happened because of geographical separation due to the Congo River. So the bonobos are found to the south of the Congo River, and the chimpanzees are found to the north of the Congo River. And the Congo River is a deep, wide river, and chimpanzees and bonobos can't swim, and so they never cross it. But it's thought in the past there was a time when the river levels, the water levels were low, and the idea is, and we'll never know if this is true for sure, but the idea is that a population of those primates traveled across the river at one point. So the original population would have been north of the river, and then a small group, the founder group, traveled across the river. And then the river levels rose again. And so they became isolated. And the environments on each side were quite different. So the hypothesis is that to the north of the river, there was less food, and there were also gorillas there. And so the population there had to, individuals that were able to fight for the food and fight to defend themselves against gorillas, perhaps, would have been more successful. And so they would have passed on those traits to their offspring, those more aggressive traits. And so the chimpanzees evolved to become more aggressive so that they could survive in that environment. Whereas to the south, it's hypothesized that their food was more abundant and there were no gorillas there. And so it was a sort of a more peaceful environment, and there wasn't a need to be aggressive. And in fact, maybe if individuals were aggressive there, maybe they would have been less likely to find a mate and less likely to reproduce. They wouldn't have been liked by their peers. And to be successful there, where everything is peaceful, you'd be better off being a kind, loving, gentle primate, because then you're more likely to find a mate and to reproduce. And so then over time, those traits were increasing in that population. So bonobos became these sort of gentler animals. That's the hypothesis. That example there is an example of what we call allopatric speciation. So it just means, allopatric just means speciation following geographical separation. And so on the left here, you can see two squirrels, I think that's in the Grand Canyon, that evolved due to separation by the Grand Canyon. That's another example. That's allopatric speciation. But there is another way speciation can happen. That's sympatric speciation, and that occurs when the two populations exist in the same geographical area, but their gene pools are separated for other reasons, either behavioral or what we call temporal. Temporal just means differences in timing. Okay, so let's look at those in a little more detail. So again, here's a diagram showing the difference between sympatric and allopatric speciation, in this case with a forest of trees. And so that original population of trees on the right was separated by a mountain range. Obviously, this is the long time scale, right? You would expect different environmental conditions on either side of a mountain for sure. One side would probably be wetter, one side would be drier. And so those trees evolved along different pathways to adapt to those different environments, becoming different species. That's allopatric speciation. If for whatever reason those populations were able to, that original population was able to be separated so that it couldn't, two different groups couldn't interbreed with each other, and that separation was maintained even though they're geographically together, they could evolve down different paths. That's called sympatric speciation. That's harder to imagine how that might occur, especially in this example with the trees, but that does happen. So again, geographical barriers lead to allopatric speciation. What kind of barriers lead to sympatric speciation? Well, again, it's behavioral and temporal. Behavioral, usually the case with animals, but it would mean things like perhaps a mating call, right? So birds communicate through song, for example. And what if a population develops a slightly different song? Maybe they're a city-dwelling bird and they develop a different song. This kind of thing does happen. And then maybe the city-dwelling birds end up flying back to the forest again, but now they have a different song. But they're in the same location as the other population that always stayed in the forest. So they have different behaviors. Even though they could theoretically interbreed, they don't, because they don't recognize each other's songs anymore. It's almost like they have a different culture, a different behavior, and that creates a reproductive barrier. It separates gene pools, and now those two populations can follow their own evolutionary pathways, even though they're existing together. The other thing that sometimes happens is differences in timing. That could happen with trees as well. So perhaps timing of reproduction. Think of trees and when they produce pollen. Here the sugi. The sugi tree makes its pollen first, and then it's the hinoki. And so even if it was possible for that pollen of those different trees to pollinate each other, they can't because they're being produced at different times. And so that sometimes happens for various reasons. In this diagram, they're showing frogs, which reproduce at different times of the year. And so they would never be able to interbreed because their timing of reproduction is different. That's called a temporal barrier. I already made the point that speciation is the source of biodiversity that we see on the planet today. You do need to understand this concept of adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is just an example of speciation happening a lot within a given area from a certain starting population, ancestral population, leading to many different species within the same area, creating this large biodiversity within that area, and also allowing many different closely related species to coexist within different environmental niches within an area. So the classic example is the Galapagos finches. So it's hypothesized that all these different species of bird, these finches, all evolved from a single species of bird that first colonized the Galapagos Islands. And even though they all exist within the same sort of area, they all started to take advantage of different niches within that ecosystem. And in this case, it was really about their food source. So some of them would eat nuts, for example, and some would eat, I don't know, worms. Okay, I can't remember all the examples, but you get the idea. So if you're eating nuts, you need a big, strong beak, right? If you're eating worms, you might need a more pointy beak to pick them out of the ground. And so the different populations developed different sort of preferences for their food, and then they started to evolve, those different populations evolved to be able to take advantage of those various food sources, and they became quite different over time, and eventually became different species. They became so different they couldn't interbreed with each other anymore. And now all of these different species can coexist very peacefully without competing with each other because they're able to take advantage of different niches. And we have a big biodiversity now of birds where we only had one species. Originally, we have many species now. This kind of thing can happen in a place where there's lots of vacant niches. So maybe there weren't many birds initially in this ecosystem. And so when birds arrived, they were able to fill all the niches and evolve to be adapted to those various niches in that environment. All right, so we've looked at different ways that populations can be isolated from each other to make speciation possible. We also want to consider how that separation can be maintained, and specifically looking at two examples more closely. So one is differences in courtship behavior, which I already mentioned. And the other one, which I haven't mentioned in this presentation, but we've talked about before, is the sterility of hybrids that may form. So let's just look at each briefly. So courtship behavior is common in a lot of animals. What you're seeing here is one species of a bird of paradise from Papua New Guinea. And they have really complex courtship behaviors. You can see this bird has this amazing color pattern, and it will do this dance and make these sort of clicking noises to court a mate. And so they can't get a mate unless they have this, they understand and are able to perform this very specific behavior. So even if it were possible for different species to interbreed, like biologically possible, it never happens because they have developed such complicated behaviors that vary by species. So it's impossible that one species would interbreed with another one because of these complex courtship behaviors. So their courtship behaviors are a way to prevent interspecific mating. In other words, mating between different species, which would ultimately undo speciation. It would bring a gene pool back together and create a single population of interbreeding individuals that would be on average quite similar over time. So courtship behavior maintains the separation and allows for speciation to occur. Another way that interbreeding among different species is prevented. It's not really prevented, but it doesn't allow for mixing of the gene pool, is sterile hybrids. So for example, a horse and a donkey, they're close enough to each other that they can interbreed, but they have different numbers of chromosomes. So horses have 64, donkeys have 62, and when they do produce an offspring, if they do interbreed, they do make a hybrid called a mule, and mules have 63 chromosomes. Now we'll learn more about why this is the case later, but if you have an odd number of chromosomes, so 63 is an odd number, that creates issues with meiosis, which is the process that produces gametes. And so mules can't produce gametes, and so they're sterile, meaning they cannot have offspring. So even though the donkey and the horse were able to mate and produce an offspring, the offspring is infertile, it's sterile. And so that path was not allowed to continue. And therefore, those gene pools, the horse's gene pool and the donkey's gene pools, have been effectively kept separate. Yes, there was mixing in the mule, but it was not possible for that path to continue on. And so this often happens where hybrids can form, but they're sterile, and that maintains separation between different populations and different species, and allows for those differences to be maintained. The last thing in this section is just a specific example of how speciation can happen very quickly. So normally speciation happens slowly. It's a gradual process. Small change builds on small change across successive generations over very long time periods. And since life has been around for such a long time, that's created some big changes, but over very long time periods. It is true, though, that sometimes speciation can happen very quickly. And one way that can happen is through processes like hybridization and polyploidy. And this happens commonly in plants. So just a few vocab things, and we will come back to some of this in later sections when we look at cell division. So ploidy is referring to the number of sets of chromosomes within a cell of a given species. So for example, humans are diploid organisms. So we have 2 copies, essentially, of every chromosome, 2 versions of each chromosome, one from our mom, one from our dad. And so most of our cells are diploid. We do make haploid cells, which only have 1 of each chromosome type when we do meiosis, which is when we make gametes. Gametes are egg or sperm. And so we are mostly diploid cells. We also make haploid cells for reproduction. But different ploidies are also possible. You could be triploid, you could be tetraploid, and so on. It does not mean if you're triploid, you have 3 parents, or if you're tetraploid, you have 4 parents. These cases occur because of errors in cell division. Usually those kinds of errors in cell division in animals, usually that leads to an organism that's not viable, that doesn't work, that dies, essentially. But in plants are a little more flexible with their ploidy. And so sometimes there's a mistake and they get an extra set of chromosomes, but it still results in a viable organism, a plant that's just fine. So this happens in plants quite a bit. It does happen in animals sometimes, I think some like frogs and so on, but it's less common. So how do we get these triploid and tetraploid and hexaploid? How do we get these different ploidies, that different numbers of chromosomes beyond the sort of normal haploid and diploid? One way is if the process of producing gametes, so meiosis, doesn't work properly and we don't actually get haploid gametes. We don't get gametes with half the number of chromosomes. We get gametes which have the same number of chromosomes that we have. In those cases, if you make a gamete that has the same number of chromosomes that you have in all your other cells, and then those gametes fuse together during fertilization to make offspring, the offspring will now have twice the number of chromosomes. If that happens within a given species, within a given population, that's called autopolyploidy, because it's happening within the same species, right? So a given individual is making an unusual gamete with double the chromosomes than usual, and if 2 of those gametes fuse, during fertilization, you get a polyploid, in this case, tetraploid individual. So that's autopolyploidy happening within the same population. There's also this idea of allopolyploidy, which is happening across different species. So it involves hybridization. So in this example, and this can happen in different ways, in this example we have the problem with meiosis, producing gametes that don't have half the number of chromosomes, and we have that happening in different species, and then we have those different species interbreeding, producing a hybrid polyploid offspring. Now that's called allopolyploidy because we had allo means different, so we had different species interbreeding, and we had this meiosis problem. Now I said this can happen in different ways. Sometimes you can have the hybridization first and then the meiosis mistake second. So in this, what's shown in the diagram here is a meiosis mistake happening in two different populations, and then fertilization producing the polyploid offspring. But it can happen the other way, where you just have hybridization first, so you have regular gametes, and then you produce an offspring that has a normal number of chromosomes, and then there's a mistake in meiosis just once, and it produces this polyploid population. These kinds of things are quite rare. They're not super common, but they just have to happen once, right? Now, how does this lead to speciation? Like, why do we say it's speciation? Because these populations that are now polyploid, either auto or allopolyploid, they can no longer interbreed with their parent population. So within just one generation, we actually get a new species. This image is showing why. And so if I had a polyploid individual, the 4n at the top, and it had the original population that was a diploid, 2n, and they produce gametes, the normal way gametes have half the number of chromosomes. And those gametes try to fuse to make an offspring. You'll end up with offspring which have an odd chromosome number, which doesn't work for meiosis. It's sort of like the mule issue. And so you end up with these infertile offspring. And so through hybridization and polyploidy, we can get a population of individuals with a different number of chromosomes, which is reproductively isolated from the parent population. And they might all, they will be already different from the parent population. Just having a different chromosome number will change your traits, so they'll already look different. But now they're not geographically, they're reproductively isolated from each other, so they can now follow different paths of evolution. It's sort of like instantaneous speciation, but it also creates a reproductive barrier, so more speciation can happen. It's a kind of sympatric speciation because they'll still exist in the same area, but they're reproductively isolated from each other. That process of speciation through ploidy and hybridization, in this case specifically through allopolyploidy, so hybridization across different species and then the change in number of chromosomes, has happened a lot in the genus Persicaria. They're commonly known as smartweeds, and you can see some different examples there of a diploid, tetraploid, and even hexaploid species. And it's thought that those all arose through this kind of process. I took that explanation there from savemyexams.com. So this is explained in lots of places. The images there are different species of Persicaria. I think there's like 100 different species, and it's thought that a lot of them evolved through these kinds of events. It's a little hard to understand, I think, this concept because we haven't looked at cell division yet. So I think when we look at cell division and mitosis and meiosis, maybe we'll come back and revisit this and see if it makes a bit more sense then. There are a couple of videos here that are just 2 minutes that help explain some of these concepts maybe better than me. especially since I had a hard time explaining things today for whatever reason. I think because I haven't been teaching, so I haven't been talking very much. So I encourage you to check these out. I'll post those up as well. There's one really quick explanation of how the chimpanzees and bonobos may have formed, may have evolved. And there's another explanation of another example of how speciation by polyploidy can occur in plants. So check those out. I hope this is useful. Thank you. Bye-bye.